And now I'm joined by my colleague Julia Manchester, political reporter with The Hill, for an overview of the Republican convention and what both parties need to do to be successful at the ballot box in 68 days. Julia, great to see you. Let me just start out on you. We just heard Mercedes Schlapp, and basically gave us a picture of that the president was going to come in with a unity message, speak to all Americans, and really depicting the Democrats as the ones that are dividing the nation. Is that working?
Steve, we've sort of seen an evolution through this convention in terms of messaging. On Monday night, we saw a very hardcore, intense message from Republicans like Kimberly Guilfoyle, Donald Trump Jr., a number of other Republicans, warning that America simply will not be safe under a President Biden, and that they were essentially urging, I would argue, suburban voters in particular to vote for President Trump, really pushing forward this law and order message. Now, that message, many would argue, does not apply to the whole of the country. That is very much speaking to these swing suburban voters and President Trump's base. However, as we've gone through the convention over this past week, we've seen some attempts to soften President Trump. Kayleigh McEnany, the White House press secretary, gave an incredibly moving and deeply personal account about how she had to get a double mastectomy at some point, and President Trump was one of the first people to call her. Laura Trump, the president's daughter-in-law, talked about how she was welcomed into the Trump family and how she felt at home there, with President Trump being her father-in-law. Eric Trump gave a very, I would say, more emotional speech than most of the president's other friends, saying, I love you, Dad. We're going to continue fighting for you. So there has definitely been an attempt to soften and maybe create more of a unified tone. But I would argue that this law and order message only applies really to the base and maybe suburban voters who are probably on the fence right now.
There were some things that really stood out for me, and I was talking to Janet McGee a minute ago about one of them, which was, the way in Donald Trump, both with, victims of COVID, and that was, a diverse group of people there, frontline workers, police, but we also had immigrants that had achieved their citizenship. Janet McGee called it a shotgun wedding. But I'm interested in whether or not the message we're seeing, and I always wonder, wow, are we now having a pro-immigration president? Is this, is that what their attempt is, or is that just blurring it? When you see the president, obviously, with a Muslim woman, with, folks from around the world getting immigration, that seems to be in some contrast with policies we've seen from this White House.
Absolutely. I think the president realizes that, for example, from the Hispanic community in general, that is not a monolithic voting bloc. We have seen certain members of parts of that voting bloc vote differently. For example, I'm from Florida, so I can speak to this. Cuban Americans, especially older Cuban Americans, tend to be more conservative, for example. So you saw a lot of speakers from Florida, whether that was Lieutenant Governor Jeanette Nunez or Pam Bondi, really talking about this issue of socialism and maybe wrapping in immigration in a way. And I think that's definitely a bit of a strategy to get some of those maybe more conservative voters in the Hispanic community. But in terms of immigration overall, I think this is definitely a strategy to kind of soften the president's message, because at the same time, we did hear Vice President Pence last night very much tout the fact that President Trump has built 300 miles of border wall along that U.S.-Mexican border. And to a lot of people listening in, that does not seem pro-immigration.
Jennifer Carroll was a lot of fun to talk to today of Maggie's List. I don't know if you've caught any of her comments, but building off of her Maggie's List work, but also Kellyanne Conway's comments last night that President Trump has appointed lots of women to lots of key posts. And that was another feature of this convention. Lots and lots and lots of women messengers in this. Is that scoring it all with the all-important suburban woman voter out there? Well, women voters everywhere. But it's suburban women and really women over 50. Are they identifying with what they've seen in the convention?
Well, we'll have to look at post-convention polling, but if we talk about this law and order message, we've actually seen polling that shows that a lot of suburban women aren't too happy with how President Trump has handled, a lot of the protests and sending in the National Guard and this very intense messaging. So I think, that has yet to be seen, but they have to be careful on this law and order message. I talked to one Republican strategist this morning who said, they would be more effective if they said safety and security instead of law and order, because that kind of softens the tone, makes it a bit more relatable and such.
So jump back 4 years ago, and guess what? Donald Trump was trailing Hillary Clinton by 9 points nationally. Guess what? Donald Trump is trailing Joe Biden nationally by 9 points. Is this a little deja vu? Is it a little bit, do the Democrats run the risk of blind spots over that lead?
Talking to Democrats, they are very cognizant of what happened in 2016, and they don't want to become apathetic at all. They say, look, going forward, we cannot get lazy. We need to keep trudging along. We can't take President Trump and his messaging for granted. So I think they're very much trying to also appeal to that suburban woman vote. We kind of saw their own variation of messaging on that at the Democratic National Convention. But at the same time, a lot has changed between now and 2016, I would argue, in the Democrats' favor. In 2018, we saw a groundswell of women elected to Congress, Democratic women in particular. So I think that's definitely something that Democrats are feeling optimistic about. However, on the other side of that, you have a very strong force within the Republican Party, and that force comes in the form of Elise Stefanik, the Republican congresswoman from New York. And essentially, she's worked very hard to recruit Republican women to run for office. And we see now that there are more Republican women running for office more than ever. So that's, they're very much trying, I think, both sides cognizant of the down ballot impact on this. So it'll be interesting to see the ties and the comparisons between now and 2016 when it comes to women voters in particular.
Julia, let me also ask you about the racial strife and the divide in the country. The protests that we're seeing, the killing of George Floyd, the shooting of Jacob Blake. And when you kind of look at the kind of these questions, which have become such an important part of the way the Democrats are defining their agenda of what needs to be fixed, I've been interested in the very heavy presence of black voices and leaders in the Republican National Convention. Herschel Walker, and you've had others. I mean, very, very compelling. Senator Tim Scott was very uplifting that first night and had a very powerful set of messages, but others as well, including Democrats from Georgia and other places. I know that this is, but I'm just trying to understand that dynamic, because when you look at the black vote in America, overwhelmingly about 95% support President Biden. What is going on with what the Republicans are trying to do there? And are they going to be able to shave off some of that community in America into the Trump camp?
Look, Republicans don't expect to win the black vote overwhelmingly in 2020 and even win it at all. However, when you say shave off, Steve, that's very important, because I think with that messaging you heard last night, they're targeting in particular, trying to appeal to in particular black men. We know that black women, throughout the past couple of decades have been very, very supportive of the Democratic Party. You often hear them referred to as the backbone of the Democratic Party. However, we've seen that President Trump, it's not a groundswell of support by any means, but he does have some support among black men in polls. So I think there's a strategy in whether, they can shave off some of that support and kind of add it to that Rolodex going into November. And I think you're here, with early voting and such, you're definitely going to hear more of that from President Trump ahead of time, because we know that, with coronavirus, people are voting earlier, and early voting and mail-in voting sometimes, tends to benefit communities of color. So this is very strategic on their part.
So I'm going to ask you just real finally, Julia, a fun question. If you were judging a boxing match and there was not a knockout, and it was between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris, and their speeches, the background, the vice president last night had Fort McHenry as the background, who would you give the win to?
I'll preface it with this. It depends who you talk to, but Kamala Harris just has the advantage of the historic backdrop of her address, being the first black woman, the first woman of South Asian descent to sit on a presidential ticket in this country. That was historic in itself. She was opened by, had an opener from probably one of the most popular past presidents and living presidents that we've had, from President Barack Obama. So I would say overall, probably Kamala Harris, just because of her history and how this campaign is played out and such. That being said, I think Vice President Pence's address was very, very important to President Trump's base, and having it at Fort McHenry and stuff and such, that definitely is something that was a draw to that base.
Well, Julia Manchester, my colleague here at The Hill, we have a lot of fun having these conversations back and forth. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.